Hello you, it's me. Today we're going to talk about The Hero of Ages, which is the last book in the Era 1 Mistborn trilogy. I will be talking about events leading up to book 3, so there will be spoilers in this review for books 1 and 2. Read these before you watch this. I also have reviews for both of them, so check those out on my channel. Link at the end. This video will have the plot of the book, the review, stuff I liked, stuff I didn't like, and an unanswered questions about the Cosmere and how this all relates section at the end. General wafflings, but it will all be marked on the time bar down below. We pick up some time after the end of book 2 where Vin was tricked by a malevolent entity into releasing it from the Well of Ascension by refusing to take the power for herself. Elend, on his deathbed, ate a mysterious bead of metal that made him into a Mistborn. The entity Ruin now lays waste to the land, thickening the ash falls to bury everything, taking control of legions of Colossus to slaughter people and raze human settlements to the ground. The mists come in the day now, as well as in the night, killing seemingly at random. The Lord Ruler foresaw the rise of Ruin and left caches of supplies underneath cities he conquered, along with what Vin hopes are instructions on how to survive, how to beat Ruin. Sazed and Breeze travel to the city of Urto to try and establish diplomatic relations, while Vin and Elend try to take the city of Fadrex to open the caches underneath, one of which they hope will contain the Lord Ruler's atium supply. Meanwhile, the Kandra Tensoon, who we met in the last book, faces trial for breaking his contract and crimes against his species. This book feels like it reads very differently to both the other two in the series. I think it's mainly because we follow 3 or 4 very geographically separate storylines, which only culminate at the very end of the book in the big finale. So I was blasting through this book. I was sort of not too invested in some storylines, whereas some storylines I was like, oh my god, I can't wait to get back to that. The pace changes madly in this book. It varies a lot. In the beginning, with Tensoon's character, you're talking about things happening over the span of weeks and months. There's a lot of time skipping through the story. It's honestly very slow for the first half. And then in the last 150, 200 pages, it's like bang, 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 bang. Not so much in an info dump Sanderlaunch sense, but just in the sense that things start to happen very quickly as the plots come together. I'm not sure how I felt about character development in this book. Not in the series, just in this book. On one hand, you had some characters who had zero development, like Vin, who pretty much was a fully formed character at the end of book 2. Yes, things happened to Vin, but I don't think in this book they necessarily changed who she was. Elend's deal was kind of weird because I feel like a bunch of character development happened for him between books 2 and 3. And we caught up with him as a fully confident Mistborn who is a confident king, a confident leader, a confident warrior. But during this book, he didn't really change much between the start and the end. Another character who we met in this book was Spook. We met them again. They did have a little bit of growth in this one, but I really wish for those 2 characters so much hadn't happened off screen. I was really glad for the development we did get with Spook. I really feel like he wasn't done justice at all in books 1 and 2. And Sazed. Sazed has this emotional turmoil going on after the death of Tindwyl in Well of Ascension that's made him completely cast everything he believed in into doubt. He's questioning the point of his existence as an archive for religions, for cultures. Sazed really quietly and in the background, I think, is the best developed character over the course of the trilogy. And you really see a different side of him in every book, with people like Breeze and Spook and them being affected by the death of clubs. One thing I liked was the characters you thought in book 1 may not necessarily ever be more than side characters did turn out to be important to the plot. Except maybe for Ham, who I thought would do more. Also in this book, in terms of character development, you get a bit more insight into who the Lord Ruler was, why they did what they did, and how in trying to fix mistake after mistake, they just made things horribly worse. With the characters growing, one we didn't necessarily see grow, but who we got kind of fleshed out was Tensoon. Through him, we learned so much more about Kandra society, how their system works, where they come from, what their core beliefs are. We learn about the contracts and how that's central to their culture. And finally, how they relate to mist wraiths and what makes them different. We also, speaking of fantasy races, learn more about the Colossus, where the Colossus came from. Wasn't something I guessed at all, but we'll talk more about that. I've read in a couple of reviews that people thought this book was maybe a bit heavy on the action sequences. And honestly, for me, it was such a breath of fresh air after nothing fun happened for like 50% of book 2. The choreography of the battles wasn't overwhelming. Sanderson manages to keep this huge level of detail up in the fight scenes without slowing the fight scene down by scrutinizing every single little detail. It really makes you feel like you're there in the moment. It makes you understand that safety is not guaranteed for anyone. And I've said in my reviews for other Sanderson stuff, it is very difficult to tie magic into close combat without making it seem kind of somehow cringy. It took me ages to actually get up and write this review, and I've had to go back over it and read summaries and flick back through the book, because while I still had like the vibe and the general impressions of it in my head, about 3 days after finishing this book, I forgot like everything that happened in it. I enjoyed this a heck of a lot, but I somehow don't think it was as memorable to me as Elantris or Warbreaker. But maybe it will be eventually as it kind of ties into the rest of the Mistborn eras and I become like Cosmere aware. Maybe I need to reread this to hammer it into my brain again. I will say though that if I had read these back to back, I probably would have been very exhausted very quickly. I'm super glad I took a lot of breaks in between them to read other non-Sanderson stuff. Spoiler bits, turn back now. If you haven't read this book, you have been warned. Stuff I really liked. Knowing that Mistborn Era 2 and presumably Mistborn Era 3, 4, whatever are set in the future, I'm really glad that there won't have been a peaceful, boring wind down for Elend and Vin. While yes, it is sad they both died, I'm actually glad. I think it tied off this story really well and made it feel like a complete trilogy that's finished. I feel like the ending with them gone is the promise of more, but more new stuff. Exploring the world from different angles, new aspects of it. While the ending wasn't happy for either of them, I feel like they did achieve their goals, and even though they lost their lives, they won. The bit in Urto, I think, where Spook is talking to the apparition that he thinks is Kelsier, but turns out to be Ruin the whole time. I was debating for a while in my head whether I thought this was Kelsier or not, come back from the dead or some kind of manifestation of him. And I think that would have been really easy to work into the story, but I'm glad that Sanderson didn't because I feel like it would have been cheap. I'm glad when people die in this book, they die. They die forever. I love the twist with the Hemalurgy about Vin's earring, Reen's voice whispering in her head turning out to have been Ruin the whole time. That was fantastic. I also did not call the twist about Kandra being paid their contracts in Atium, and the reasoning behind that. That was probably my favourite twist because it answered so many questions I had. I think Sazed had the best resolution of any character in this series. How essentially becoming a god at the end of everything and rebuilding the world was the natural final step in his collecting, questioning, dismissing, and then finding true faith in his religion. I thought the curve of that arc was lovely. One of my favourite bits in the book was where Tensoon is said to have smiled at Sazed, but this happens when Tensoon was a horse, and the image of that in my mind was comedy gold. Stuff I wasn't too keen on. I felt personally like Hemalurgy was info dumped about how it works, what it is, and is in the epigraphs because maybe the author couldn't find a way to tie it into the story, to tie learning about it into the story. It was the only bit for me of the whole trilogy which did not feel organic, and you realise with these epigraphs that the information you're being given is very different from the information that Vin and Elend have. So you're piecing together a very different view of the world than them. So I guess, is that some kind of dramatic irony? I wish there had been a better way that Hemalurgy was introduced. I wish that Sazed being the hero of ages hadn't been spoiled for me so early on in the book, with big, obvious red blinking light clues. I think if I hadn't known right up until the end when it happened, it would have absolutely blown my mind apart. With Sazed holding out right to the end with this totally unbroken faith in Vin, being the chosen one, that she would fix everything. While seeing it coming didn't detract from my enjoyment of it, and I certainly didn't call him becoming God. I think it would have hit harder if the hints were more subtle and I'd only recognise them in hindsight. I was not a huge fan of Belray. I feel like there were big chunks of the Urto storyline only put in because spook deserved a romance and some kind of happy ending. Although I loved his whole arc about being the next survivor, I thought that was fantastic. Her inclusion felt to me a bit too convenient in terms of storytelling. I also feel that some passages in this book maybe weren't necessary, and it could have been a weeny bit shorter and exactly the same book. I do want to say, though, that Sanderson is a very consistent world builder. He leaves very few holes in the things he stitches together, which is what makes me look at them so closely. I love pulling things apart because there is so little to pull apart. And the tiny, tiny things I pick up on, which I post on the Cosmere Discord as I'm reading, so join that if you want, just serve to showcase how absolutely rock solid the rest of everything else is. Saying that, I do have some questions. As usual, here we go. Question time! What the heck were the physical bodies left behind after Preservation and Ruin died? A man with a prominent nose and black hair? A man with bright red hair? Super weird, and I feel like if I was Cosmere aware, maybe I'd get something from that. Also, in one of the epigraphs, it talks about the scene where Preservation dies, the scene with it finally dying and the body falling to the ground. Describes the body and describes the body getting covered by ash. But Sazed, the person that wrote the epigraphs, wasn't there and didn't see that. Nobody saw it. So did Preservation have all the memories of the last host or shell? Did Sazed inherit the memories when the power was passed on? Who were those two guys with the Kandra? It said that some of the Kandra in the homeland had 4 arms. The musculature for 4 arms and how 2 extra arms would connect would be very different to the musculature for just 2 arms. And it doesn't exist anywhere in humans, in mammals. So they couldn't have digested a 4-armed human and learned it. So can Kandra who are smart just improvise muscle arrangement? Or can they take musculature from one animal and apply it to another? Could a Kandra take the form of something completely imaginary if it had a sufficient support system inside it? Do all of them lose the ability to just muscles together as a Mistwraith when they become sentient? What happens if you cut a Kandra in half? If the halves live, can they communicate? Can a Kandra split into mini Kandra? And why do the generations of Kandra after the first generation have a completely different naming convention? Their names are made up of 2 words with 2 capital letters. But where did that originate? We get an insight into the Colossus, with the spikes being used to kill 4 or 5 humans, then hammered into another human to make it turn into a Colossus. But what happens if you pull the spikes out of a Colossus that is still alive? Do you get the human back? Does the thing stop growing? Do they die? I still have some questions about metal burning. I'd like to know where metal goes once you burn it. Does it vanish from existence, or does it turn into a waste product that you poop out? If the former, with everybody making metal vanish into thin air, does it mean that in Era 3, Era 4, Era however many, there are going to be metal shortages because it's just vanishing? And I still don't really have a satisfactory answer about when you burn steel, you see the line from that object to yourself, but it goes to your chest and not your stomach where the metals are being burnt. Why? The Kandra didn't all kill themselves. It says they didn't all do it. Will they be here for further eras? Will they be afforded the same rights as people? Human people? What happened to the Mistwraiths when Sazed basically rewrote reality? Will Atium be a thing that even exists in future books? Being the body of a god. Also, there was one bit where Vin went into the city, I think into Fadrex, to meet with contacts. She met the first one, was on her way to meet the second one, which was Hoyd. But as she approached the square where Hoyd was meant to be waiting for her, she sensed sudden danger, somebody burning metal, and then abruptly stop. She really felt like she was in trouble, and she legged it to get away. And considering that she can face up to armies of Colossus, something must have been very wrong. Was Hoyd waiting to ambush her? I also noticed that reading this series, at the start of the chapters you have symbols, some of which correspond with the metals we have in the charts at the back of the book. But there are 23. In book 1, the symbols are allomantic. In book 2, they're ferrochemical. And in book 3, I assume they're hemalurgic. But there are 23 unique symbols. And I'm calling it now that is the number of metals we are going to get across the whole of Mistborn. I'm going to give this book 4 stars. I honestly think, as a trilogy, it's such a great place to jump in if you want to read fantasy and you haven't read much fantasy before. It's well written, the characters are likeable and memorable, which is so important. The magic system and the world build overall is so original. And I think going into this book, it may not necessarily be what you'd expect from a fantasy novel. I can't wait to find out how this fits into the Cosmere as a whole. And I really think I will be remembering and picking up on stuff that is important later, like way further down the line. And maybe this series will be even better, even more full of mysteries and hints and juicy secrets the second time round on a reread. So I'll get back to it one day, probably. If you want to talk about Brandon Sanderson with us on the Cosmere Crab Along Discord, I'll link that down below. You can join. Also, join our Interstellar Book Club Sci-Fi Discord if you like talking about science fiction. That's linked down below as well. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more single book reviews. Don't forget to follow me on Goodreads and Twitter. Also linked down below. I'm on Readerly now as well, and my @ is Max. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next review. Bye!